Brothers and sisters in Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين وصحبه الراشدين المباركين والتابعين لهم بخير من السنة إلى يوم الدين وعلينا معهم وفيهم برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. So, my beloved brothers and sisters in Islam, and as well as those of you who are not Muslims who are watching, we thank you for watching this video. And after it's finished, or even right now, you can share it on your feeds in the WhatsApp group, because we are going to try to give some very succinct yet vital information in regards to the amendment of the Elliot Larsen Act, which is a civil rights act that is in the state of Michigan. It's a statewide act in which there are proposed amendments to change it and expand it that, if passed as is, will jeopardize the religious rights of our community of Muslims as well as other religious groups. I have three quick things to say before I bring on our staff attorney, Sister Amy, as well as which will give a breakdown. She will give a breakdown of what is problematic legally in this particular situation. Then Sister Noor, who's our director of Safe Spaces, will give us some action items. But beforehand, I have three very brief things to say in regards to this issue. And the first of those that I would like to mention is, we as an organization, CAIR Michigan, we are a non-partisan organization that's based in Islamic values, right? Our advocacy is based on our Islamic values. We are not liberals nor conservatives. We are not so-called progressives, nor are we so-called MAGA, right? We are an organization that places certain principles over personalities and parties. And it's very important to understand because, many people in our community will say, well, such and such supports this bill, or such and such co-sponsored this bill, or these people who put forward this, they are our so-called allies. And we don't see anyone as being permanent allies. We have permanent interests, and we're going to stand for those interests in particular, in which the number one objective, or the maqsad of our sacred way, is Hizful Deen. It is the protection and preservation of our noble way of life, of our sacred practice of Islam. This is the first maqsad of the maqasid of our sacred way. This is number one. The second thing that I would like to mention in regards, and when we're talking about this issue, is that we as an organization, and I'm just saying this in regards to the first point that I made, is we as an organization in this particular issue that we are talking about is not about us trying to expand our rights or bring forth any new rights for American Muslims who reside in the state of Michigan, be they citizens or legal permanent residents or here on visas. We are here to preserve for our constituents and our institutions, as well as the religious rights of others, already existing law that could be placed in jeopardy with the current wording of this particular amendment, in which Sister Amy will go into further, because what is being written or proposed is actually unprecedented in America. It's literally unprecedented. There's something that's being attempted that is literally unprecedented, right? The third point is, and going back to the first, but point is that us being a religion being an organization that's nonpartisan, that's based in Islamic values, that no intelligent group of people or no intelligent advocacy organization will give up the rights of its own community in the name of trying to accommodate others. In other words, other communities have special interest groups, and they stand up for their special interests, right? We are a organization with a special interest, and our first interest is to protect the religious practice and the freedom of conscience of Muslims who reside in the state of Michigan. This is our number one objective as an organization, right? So it would be unintelligent for us to say in the name of accommodating someone else that we are going to be willing to forego our rights. And actually, if any religious leader, if any business leader, if any organizer, activist, or politician who is Muslim, who is calling for that, by Allah, they don't understand Islam, right? As individuals, we can pardon and give up some of our own rights. And this actually was part of what's called fatwa or Islamic chivalry, right? I can give up my own personal right for somebody else if I choose to give up my right in order to have someone have their right. But as a leader or as a community, no one person or no one organization can say that we are going to forfeit the rights or the sacred rights of the Muslim community as a Muslim in order to be accepted by other people. La yajuz. This is impermissible according to the sacred law. So any Muslim, again, they could be a sheikh, they could be a politician, they could be a business leader, they could be a community organizer, they could be an activist. If they have this understanding by Allah, they don't understand Islam. And I can say this with 100% confidence. They don't understand our sacred law and our sacred tradition. With that, I'm going to take myself off the screen and let Sister Amy talk about number one, to clarify some misinformation that's been put out. And unfortunately, this misinformation is being put out by one particular political leaning in our state. There's some misinformation that's being put out about the potential jeopardy it would cause our community and our Catholic partners, like at Michigan Catholic Conference and other religious groups and organizations. And then also, Sister Amy will then also give some very tangible examples in terms of what we are looking for and what we are asking for. Sister Amy, tafadali.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. First, I'd like to start by explaining a little bit about what the Elliot Larsen Civil Rights Act is. The Elliot Larsen Civil Rights Act is a law that is in the state of Michigan that protects the civil rights of individuals. It protects persons based on their status within a protected class, whether it's race, religion, national origin, or gender, to name a few. What's being done now is the Michigan legislature is trying to expand the act to include some classes of individuals that were identified by the Supreme Court of Michigan last year in a very prevailing case law. So they're trying to expand the rights of certain individuals. But what they're doing is they're doing it in a way that could cause real jeopardy for our religions and our religious institutions by making religious institutions or our religious nonprofit organizations that are doing religious work, such as social work or relief work, by making them have to certify things like the fact that marriage can be between two persons of the same gender that clearly violate our religious tenets and the religious tenets of so many other faith-based groups in Michigan. So what we're asking, and what Michigan Catholic Conference is asking, and a lot of other religious faith-based organizations are asking, is that the legislature takes into account the ways in which this could jeopardize our religious institutions and add in religious protections. The religious protections that we're asking to be added in are religious protections that were already afforded in the law. We're not asking for, like, as Brother Dawood said, an expansion of our rights, but we're really asking them to solidify and enshrine our rights within the law in the same way that they're enshrining the rights of other individuals with this expansion of this law. And as Brother Dawood said, there's a lot of misinformation being put out there. There's a lot of rhetorical talking points that just really miss the mark. And the first misinformation that's being put out there is that religion's already a protected class because it's written right in the statute. It protects religion, it protects race, it protects national origin. And that's true. The Elliot Larsen Civil Rights Act, in fact, does protect religion, but the statute itself is intended to protect individuals. It does not protect institutions or organizations. In fact, the statute itself is intended to govern or dictate or sort of guide the behavior of organizations that deal with individuals. So even though religion is a protected class, it protects you or me from going into a place and being discriminated against. It does not protect our religious organizations when they're out doing religious work in a way that interferes with, you know, the ideology that maybe doesn't fit within our religious beliefs. So as such, even though religion is protected within the statute, it provides no religious protections for our institutions. And so the second talking point that we hear a lot of politicians talking about, well, this is inevitable. This is going to happen. The Michigan Supreme Court already decided that sexual orientation and gender identity is going to be protected. And that's fine. And that's true. So they can expand the law to include that. But what they're kind of misleading people about is the fact that religious protections are already guaranteed to us by the Michigan Supreme Court and federal courts and other courts throughout, Michigan and the country. So, but what they're making this argument that, well, we don't need to protect religious rights in the statute because they're already granted by the courts. But then they're protecting other people's rights that have also already been protected by the courts. And what this does is this leaves it sort of open for interpretation, and it creates this ambiguity about how the interplay or the exchange of those rights are going to take place. And it's kind of really misinformation for people to say that because there's this case law, what we call precedent, or something that's already been decided that governs a certain way, that even after the law is written, it's going to govern the same way. And we don't know that, because when the law changes, the case law that comes before it interpreting the law without that provision, and it no longer applies in the same way. And a lot of it has to do with legislative intent. So we don't know how this is going to play out. And what that means is if they don't actually write it into the statute to say, listen, we're protecting this group's rights, but we're also making sure that we're intending to protect religious rights as well, it leaves it open for interpretation, and it leaves our religious organizations, vulnerable to litigation. And while these politicians would have you believe that that's just speculative, and the Attorney General's office said it's speculative and they can't guard against things that are speculative, that's just not the case. It's not speculative. What we've seen happen in other states that have passed this law is we've seen direct challenges to religious organizations and institutions, including higher education, like religious seminaries. We've seen direct challenges to their rights by special interest groups after these types of laws are passed. And in fact, there was a case that was decided last year in New York, after New York passed an expansion of this law, where an LGBT group went into a Jewish seminary, a school that was creating Jewish religious scholars, with the purpose of creating this group that was directly adverse to the religious teachings of the school. And when the school wouldn't allow them to, they sued the school, and they actually won. So the school had to then either allow a student group that was espousing values that were directly against their religious teachings, or they had to cancel all of the student groups in the entire school. So it's this like picking away at our rights to the case law. And the real way to protect that is to make sure that the legislative intent is clear, that yes, we are expanding to recognize this class of individuals that was recognized by the Supreme Court, but it's our intent to still leave these protections in place for our religious institutions. And really that's what we're asking to do. Another thing that I heard recently from one politician in particular is that they're not an attorney. They don't know how the case law is going to be settled. They don't understand. So they went to the AG's office. And the Attorney General of the state of Michigan, they say, is a nonpartisan group. And unfortunately, while that's just not the case. while the Attorney General's office is supposed to be nonpartisan, the head of the Attorney General's office, Dana Nessel, is an elected official. She was elected on a very partisan ticket. She was elected on a very liberal Democratic ticket. And she sets the policy. She sets the tone for her office. She sets the policy. She decides what position she's going to take when laws are challenged. She decides which lawsuits the state will defend and which ones they will not. She decides which way they're going to go when we see organizations that are going to be sued as a result of this law. She will decide whether or not the state is going to intervene and clarify that they intended to protect religious protections or whether they did not, and whether they're going to defend their law. If there's a constitutional challenge, she'll decide whether or not she's going to stand with religious organizations. And I don't say that to be scary, but I say that because it's kind of important to understand where this law actually first originated. In 2020, there was a ballot initiative that was being pushed to try to get on the 2020 ballot to allow Michigan voters to make a determination about whether or not they wanted to expand the Elliot Larsen Civil Rights Act. That law was drafted primarily by Dana Nessel when she was the leader of a special interest group. And that law not only was expanding the protection for certain groups, it was actually intending and had language in it that intended to narrow the protections for religious institutions by redefining what religious expression was, and by not protecting some religious expression, which would be found like within our institutions and our organizations. So Dana Nessel drafted the first version of this law, and the first version of this law that is now being passed was expressly put in place to curtail religious freedoms. And this is the person that we're entrusting to be a nonpartisan individual who will then be, enforcing and applying and interpreting and defending this law in court. So it's important to understand that the AG's office, she's the head of it, and she'll be making these determinations. And this was her law. This was her special interest that she had. And in her special interest, she had an interest in establishing a way to, shorten or curtail religious rights. And it creates this insecurity about what will take place if this law is passed without religious protections enshrined within it. And will the state come out to defend our religious freedoms, or will they follow what was done before with the curtailment of our religious freedoms? So the last thing I want to say about the misinformation is something that I heard yesterday, is that the Elliot Larsen Civil Rights Act already exempts religious institutions via a section that people call Section 505. So that section does protect some religious institutions, like mosques and private schools, from certain provisions of the law, like what we would normally call like the clergy or the ministerial exception, meaning that they can hire people and maintain an educational environment that comports with the understandings of the principles of the faith, the faith-based teaching. So while it does have some protections, it doesn't really go far enough. So what's at stake? So what's at stake with the expansion of this law as it is without religious protections is there are various provisions within the law that could impact our religious institutions, including our social institutions that are providing foster care services or homeless shelters, even our religious schools, especially when it comes to this provision where the state will require them to sign a covenant or an agreement that says that they recognize things like the fact that marriage could be between two people of the same gender as a basis for getting state funding or entering into state contracts. So what that does is that leaves our religious institutions to decide, are we going to be able to take this funding and enter in these contracts to place Muslim foster children, or to have a homeless shelter that services domestic violence victims, or to provide soup kitchen to needy people? Or are we going to stand by the tenets of our faith? Because what it means is our faith-based organizations could face a lawsuit or a challenge to their contract, or just be denied challenges. It took decades for our religious institutions to be able to enter in these contracts and get this aid. And they really fought for these types of contracts, including Title I funding, which provides educational resources to our nonprofit religious private schools to help them with math and literacy competency. They could lose that funding because they can't enter into a contract for the administration of that funding because they want to uphold our religious values that marriage is between a biological man and a biological woman. We're not out here, not providing services to people by giving them some test for their faith, but we want to be able to practice our faith, and we want to be able to do it in a way where we're not at risk of litigation. Litigation is costly, it's lengthy, and without these religious protections written expressly within the statute, our religious institutions and organizations are vulnerable to challenges, not only just from state aid and from state contracts, but from special interest groups who are going to do things like they did in New York, which is come through and create a scenario by which they can test the boundaries of this law. And if the legislature adopted some of these provisions and especially the definition of religion and put in some limiting language on that covenant, we would actually could prevent a lot of costly litigation, because it would be really solidified what the bounds of our rights are. So that's what we've been asking the legislature to do. That's what our action alert has called for people to do. So that's what we really need to be doing. So those are that's what's at stake. We're at stake for having our most vulnerable institutions being attacked with litigation, losing their funding, losing their government contracts to administer and continue to do the types of work that are social services to not just the Muslim community, but the broader community, and that really provide a necessary service in some instances for communities that would otherwise be without that type of relief. So, that's kind of what's at stake. And I'm going to turn it over to our director of Safe Spaces, Sister Noor Ali, now, who's going to tell you, what can we do? Like, what can we do to prevent this from happening? And what can you do as an individual to ensure that your law firm make hears your voice? Exactly. Okay.
Thank you so much, Sister Amy. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. My name is Noor Ali. I'm the director of Safe Spaces here. So as you all have likely seen, we do have an action alert that is out that you can still submit and sign, and it'll send a email to your state representative or your state senator. That is still going around. Please continue to do so. Obviously, for each person, you can only do it once via the action alert. However, on your private email, you can still send that same message over and over again. That is something that all of these politicians have, like they take note of. So the other thing that you can do is call your state rep or state senator's office. I will be posting, inshallah, within the hour after our Facebook Live right now. I'll be posting a script where you can call your state senator or your state rep and just follow the script and go off of what we are asking of people, which is to include explicit religious protections in the Elliot Larsen Civil Rights Act as they are voting on upcoming amendments. As Sister Amy said, legally, this is opening our community up to potential lawsuits that are going to be extremely costly. And as we all know, just within the Muslim community, most of our masajid already cannot afford something of this nature. So in order to protect our community from this sort of vulnerability financially and socially, we should demand and hold our elected officials accountable. There are 22 other states that have expanded their civil rights law to include the same amendments that they are trying to now include in the Elliot Larsen Act. And at the same time as they voted on these amendments, they included religious protections. Michigan should not be any different. We should not have our religious communities or organizations be made to feel, ostracized and open to this sort of, these lawsuits and, again, socially, like what comes with that. So I will have on the graphic that we will be posting where you can find who your state rep and state senator are if you are not aware, and they will include the address and also the phone number of the building. That will be on mvic.sos.state.mi.us. That's just for this video. I just had to say it, but it will be included on the graphic, and it'll be a lot easier to follow and to plug in to your phone or your laptop. So yes, please continue to spread the action alert in your group chats, in email chains, on your social media, and as well as this graphic that will be posted with a script. And it's important as we, speak with these elected officials, people from specific interest groups, that we maintain, Islamic mannerisms and adab. We do not want to be, we don't want any of this to be a bad reflection on our community. We should uphold ourselves in a respectful manner and treat everybody with human dignity, inshallah. And thank you to everybody who has shown support for this initiative that CAIR Michigan is, inshallah, trying to accomplish.
Thank you very much, Sister Amy and Sister Noor. And just to highlight a couple of things and wrap it up. Number one is that there were 22 other states that passed similar legislation that had more thorough religious protections. And again, we're not asking for our rights to be expanded. We simply want language that has been introduced into other states, including California, which is the most liberal state in America, right? Like Michigan would be a real outliner, right? I mean, and I would also say, well, to those people who say, well, this is benign and don't worry. Well, if you're involved in civil rights and American history, you know very differently about how things go and how groups of people or special interests will continue to push, and they will seek to put forth agendas, just like what happened in New York, right? And these things are done strategically. So, and I strongly believe that if this is passed, that Dearborn or Dearborn Heights would probably be the first community to be targeted, or if not Hamtramck, right? And because this is a very Muslim area, and this is something very symbolic. The second point is that if this passes, Michigan will be an outlier, right? Sister Noor talked about writing or answering our action alert and then respectfully calling your state representatives. And we should all do that, and do that with the best adab, the best etiquettes, or the best mannerisms. I also will tell you this, is that we have given alternative language to 2 state representatives that mirrors language in other states that could simply be added. And we've worked with very closely the Michigan Catholic Conference, who has policy people and attorneys, and Sister Amy is an attorney, and we have policy experience, right? So like, we are actually professionals in this, and we know what we're doing. So there should not be any resistance to adding language. And if they claim that our rights are going to be protected anyway, which we know that people on the courts are elected officials, and that with one sway of 1 or 2 different people and justices, and something comes up in the court, it get ruled differently. We know how the courts work, right? Why not just go ahead and enshrine these rights? Like, what's the big deal of adding this language, right? If in fact you really care about protecting the religious rights of institutions, right? Instead of just dismissing community concerns. I will end with this and saying this, and this not to brag or boast. CAIR Michigan as an organization, every single legal action that we've taken against a government or a municipality, we have not lost any case. We've only ever lost 1 case. We've won every single case. And this relates to a civil suit relating to the wrongful death of Imam Luqman Abdullah rahmatullahi alayhi in 2009 that was shot in Dearborn, Michigan, fatally shot 20 times. But this was only relating to an issue of standing, where our case got thrown out. We didn't even try that in court. It didn't make it to court to actually trial. Every case that has gone to trial in which we sued government institutions or municipalities. I'm saying this for a reason, because we have a track record. We know about civil rights. We know about religious liberties. We know exactly what we're doing as an organization, even if some people would go around and say, oh, well, CAIR Michigan really doesn't know what they're talking about. Actually, no, we have a track record of being a bona fide religious rights and civil rights organization where we have not lost in federal court, right? So I'm just throwing that out there. We don't want things to get into litigation in regarding this particular issue. So I would just say to the elected officials who are watching it, you can get done what you want to get done in regards to the LGBTQ community and preserve the rights of religious individuals and religious institutions, or those who are not registered as religious organizations but are operating off upon religious principles, by just simply add the language, right? So just call your reps and say, just simply add the language, and we provide two of them the language, right? And if it gets passed and these individuals vote on it, then we'll have to, then we will have to, take further steps and let the community know exactly. We'll share the language of what we shared and who we shared it with, right? And we're talking about holding people accountable. Again, we're about principles over personalities and parties as an organization. Just because someone looks like me or has my same gender or follows my same religion, it doesn't mean that, they get a pass. No, that's not how we work as an organization, right? And this is not how we should operate as a Muslim community. And those of you too who are Catholics, you should be holding your Catholic elected officials responsible, accountable as well, right? So with that, my brothers and sisters in Islam, we're going to share the information. We took a half an hour, which was our plan, and we ask Almighty Allah Subhanahu wa Taala to bless us in this month of Sha'ban and have us reach the month of Ramadan. We ask Almighty Allah Subhanahu wa Taala to give Islam and the Muslims izzah, to give us honor and to give us dignity. We ask Almighty Allah Subhanahu wa Taala to have us walk in the footsteps of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam and his noble family members and his righteous, rightly guided companions. And we ask Almighty Allah Subhanahu wa Taala to guide us all. We ask Almighty Allah Subhanahu wa Taala to protect our Muslim charities and Muslim foster care service and Muslim family service and Zaman International and Helping Hand in our masajid, in our Islamic schools, from any people who would seek to scheme or plot to try to take advantage of certain situations in order to get our organizations in trouble. We ask you, Ya Allah, to protect those organizations and to protect our leaders, Ya Rabbil Alameen, who are striving to walk on a sirat al-mustaqim. Wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam tasliman kathiran da'iman abadan wa afwan minkum wa salamu alaykum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.